Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Into the Weird, The Witches of Britain. Thank you so much to everybody who listened to my previous episode on the Bideford Witches. I didn't really have any idea about who'd appreciate the episode, but the feedback I've got so far has been absolutely amazing. What I wanted to do was an episode on a very different type of witch hunt. Today, I'm going to tell you about the absolute classic in the history of British witchcraft, the story of Matthew Hopkins and the deadliest witch hunt in British history. Now, Matthew Hopkins and John Stern, his associate, are believed to be responsible for the deaths of over 100 unfortunate people in the space of around 3 years between the years 1644 and 1647 in the tumult and disorder of the English Civil War. In fact, Matthew Hopkins and John Stern have become so embedded in the history of Britain that they crop up again and again, in works of historical fiction, at least 3 biographies, cult horror films from the 1960s, a BBC sitcom from 2022, and actually, in the history GCSE that I teach my Year 9s every year, big shout out to OCR's Crime and Punishment paper. He's so deeply entrenched in the collective understanding of this country's history that there's even a Wikipedia page on Matthew Hopkins in popular culture. Hopkins has become synonymous with a kind of ghostly bogeyman who openly pursued personal enrichment and status at the expense of the lives of East Anglia's poorest and most vulnerable. In this interpretation of Hopkins, and in countless others, he is the embodiment of pure evil, a relic of a more superstitious and brutal era, in which opportunistic charlatans could ensnare gullible bumpkins into confessing to unlikely and at times ridiculous liaisons with the devil. This Hopkins stalked the eerie, flat expanses of the fens clad in black, leeching like a parasite from the credulity of the country folk. But how true is this interpretation? What is the most accurate story of Hopkins' life, and how has this depiction of Hopkins been developed? These are the questions that I'm hoping I'll be able to answer today. Now, it's worth saying that one of my aims for the project was to look at witchcraft persecution in this country from the perspective of the victims, but that wasn't at all possible in the case of Matthew Hopkins, for one main reason, and that is the sheer number of victims that he had. If I was to chart the lives of every single one of his victims, the podcast would take months to research, and it would also be about 6 hours long and pretty boring. I'll leave that work to the historians as I'm only a history teacher. So today we're going to focus on the lives of Matthew Hopkins and of John Stern due to the abundant evidence about them and their stories. In telling their stories, I'm deeply indebted to an excellent book by Malcolm Gaskill on the case, which is referenced in the description. So if you enjoy the podcast, I strongly suggest you check it out. It's exceptionally well written and it's got a beautiful cover. Now, it's fair to say that I've got less of a personal connection to the case of Hopkins than the Bideford Witches. I'm from the West Country, and the drama of Hopkins' witch hunt played out on the desolate expanses of East Anglia. My mum's from North Norfolk, but I've only ever been there once, and there's no record of Hopkins ever travelling that far north anyway. So why have I decided to do a podcast on Matthew Hopkins at all? Well, it's simply because of his infamy, and the fact that his story is so gripping. Like a classic film or series, the story's full of twists, turns, a rise, a fall, and a delicious payoff for the villain of the piece. So sit back, settle in, and let me take you back to a frosty morning in the winter of 1620 and the timber-framed rectory opposite the church of a little village called Great Wenham in Suffolk. Chapter 1. The Origins of Fear. Mary Hopkins was in an upstairs bedroom, writhing in the agony of childbirth, surrounded by a gaggle of her closest female friends and relatives. The experience of childbirth in the early modern period was one of huge tension. It represented a precarious and liminal time, in which the lives of mother and child hung in the balance. In insanitary and rudimentary conditions, boundaries between life and death were blurred in the frenzied screams of the expectant mother. But thanks to divine providence, in the Russian roulette of delivery, Mary and her child at last seemed safe. After countless hours of sweat, feverish prayers and anticipation, Mary was blessed by the arrival of her 4th child and 4th son, Matthew. The Hopkins were a well-to-do Puritan family, long established in the region. Her husband, James, was the village's rector, and originally came from Littleport in the Isle of Ely, north of Cambridgeshire. The Hopkins family had humble origins as yeoman farmers, richer peasants from the area who made their fortune by enclosing on the land of the poorer peasants, dividing the land up and making a handsome profit. With the profits of this process bringing delusions of grandeur, the yeoman farmers began to style themselves as gentlemen. One such gentleman was William Hopkins, James's father and Matthew's grandfather, who became rich enough to own multiple houses, fields, crofts, and fishing waters. When he died, his youngest son James, Matthew Hopkins' father, received 3 houses, a parcel of land, a croft, 2 feather beds, a chest full of linen, 3 fine silver spoons, and £20. Now he must have been something of a mummy's boy, because when he was 18 or 19 and still at Cambridge University, his mother died, and she left almost all of the remains of his father's estate to him instead of his older brother. So, by 1610, James Hopkins had finished his education, been ordained as a priest at Ely Cathedral. He was married to Mary, had 3 sons, James, Thomas and John, and made his living as the rector of the sleepy village of Great Wenham in Suffolk. That brings us neatly back to the birth of James and Mary's 4th son, Matthew, on the cold winter morning of 1620. Very little is known about mewling infant Matthew's early life and childhood in Great Wenham, but we can make some educated guesses based on what we already know about children's experiences generally from the time. Much the same as today, the minds of children were shaped not only by cautionary tales and scripture, but also in a cruder, older form of tuition, by stories spread by friends on cold winter's evenings. Huddled around the fire, we can imagine young Matthew and his friends swapping tales of witches and ghosts. Children believed that the gardens and fields around them were haunted by fairies and imps. Their consciousness straddled the hazy borderland between natural and supernatural realms. Without a scientific counter-narrative instilled by a modern education system, their imaginations abounded with the fear of the unseen world. We can also speculate about the enormous influence that his father's religious beliefs had on his upbringing. In the previous 100 years, England had thrown off the authority of the Pope to create a Protestant national church. However, there had been no broad agreement in England about how far the church should change from how it had been before. For some, it went too far, and for others, not far enough. James Hopkins was a man who believed there hadn't been enough change. He was outraged that images of saints still appeared in parish churches, or that people still swallowed bread and wine in what he'd have seen as a relic of a pre-Christian blood ritual. He instead believed in a religion called Puritanism based on the Bible and nothing else. Puritans saw themselves as a godly elect surrounded by a world of sinners, engaged in a constant struggle between the forces of good and evil. These tensions took on a new importance early on in Matthew's life, as the reign of Charles I brought a relapse to Catholic-seeming rituals in the Church of England. He'd have heard his father and his friends from the area, itself a hub of Puritan dissent, rail against the evils of popery and the illegitimacy of the power of the king and central government. James would have impressed on his young sons that in order to succeed in life, it wouldn't be enough for them to follow Christ in their hearts. They'd have to demonstrate their devotion in public by creating a world free from the malign influence of the devil. As Matthew grew older, he moved to Manningtree in Essex. He was a young man in a hurry, who had recently inherited a considerable amount of money and had a good deal of time on his hands. Perhaps aware of his family's modest origins as yeoman farmers, he had developed a feverish compulsion to build a reputation as a gentleman. Manningtree was a wealthy market town, surrounded by marshes, fields and dense woodland. It sat across the mile-wide estuary of the River Stour, which served as a connection to London and its untold riches. Its inhabitants in the middle of the town were ambitious artisans and tradesmen, but as the grand townhouses grew sparser and gave way to riverside paths through fields of mistletoe, the shacks and hovels of the town's poor emerged from the fog off the river. Manningtree was a town riven by religious discord and suspicion. In the time of Mary I, a man had been burnt alive for refusing to attend Mass, causing outrage in the town. Throughout the 1630s and 1640s, rumours of local ministers from outlying villages retaining Catholic elements of church services caused scandal and led to accusations that the Antichrist himself had infiltrated every branch of society. In this climate of fear, stoked by a radical Puritan magistrate, a man with a lovely name but a less lovely record in this story, Harbottle Grimston, witchcraft accusations became more and more a feature of life in Manningtree in the early 1640s. So, the moral universe inhabited by young Matthew must have created a really interesting perception of others from the local area. The community must have appeared to him like a patchwork. There were the righteous and the sinners, the godly elect and the Catholic transgressors. the newly wealthy and the newly impoverished, where the influence of the devil was a constant, tangible menace, in which those at the margins, who had not benefited from Hopkins' auspicious start to life, must have appeared especially susceptible to the temptations of the devil. The early life of Matthew's assistant, John Stern, is far more mysterious. What we do know is that Stern was almost tailor-made as a companion for Hopkins. Like Hopkins, he had grown up in rural Suffolk in the hotbed of religious radicalism. He married Agnes Corston and moved to Laws Hall, near Bury St Edmunds, where, due to the hostility of reformers, the Catholics of the village had been driven to practising their religion in secret. He had a daughter who was baptised there in 1644, but by the time of his first meeting with Hopkins, Stern was already in his mid-30s. What he was up to in Manningtree in 1645 we do not know. When 3 poor women from the area around Manningtree were accused of witchcraft in March 1645, Hopkins and Stern were ready to leap into action. In truth, they had been ready for years. Steeped in a combined 5 decades of Puritan theology, energised by the chaos of the Civil War, they must have felt that they were about to begin the greatest battle of their lives, to rid the world of the evils of the devil. Chapter 2. A growing reputation. Like many other unfortunate victims of witch hunts, Elizabeth Clark had a bad habit of not getting on with her neighbours. Her rap sheet stretched back to a year before, in which the son of the richest man in the town, Richard Edwards, had died in the care of a wet nurse who lived near Elizabeth Clark, whose reputation as a witch was already well known to the locals. Nearby, in Lawford, Anne West and her daughter Rebecca had been blamed for the death of a boy and a pig. Anne had been put on trial in March 1642, but had been acquitted and returned to the area as a social pariah. Developing a reputation as a witch among your neighbours could spell disaster for women in this time, as Elizabeth Clark and Anne and Rebecca West discovered to their cost, as they became the first victims of a witch hunt, which claimed the lives of over 100 others over the next 3 years. When Prudence Hart delivered a stillborn child, and overcome with grief, enlisted the help of John Cutler, Thomas Hart and John Eads to take legal action against Anne and Rebecca West, frenzied chattering about a coven of witches spread like wildfire across the area. In Manningtree, the elderly widow Elizabeth Clark was met by furious jeering from her neighbours as she walked the town streets, demanding to know if she was connected to Anne and Rebecca in any way. Presumably shocked and despairing at her former acquaintances turning on her, she freely admitted to practising witchcraft and knowing several other witches in the area. Once this had been revealed, John Stern and his young assistant, Matthew Hopkins, bounded into view, enlisted by the magistrate to get a formal confession out of the old woman. This local magistrate, who we met before, Harbottle Grimston, ordered the arrest of Elizabeth Clark and the search of her body by 4 experienced women for signs that she had suckled evil spirits. Now, the nature of this case is absolutely textbook in terms of English witchcraft accusation. English witch hunts differed from those in Europe in that searchers were primarily looking for evidence that the accused had made a pact with Satan in the form of familiars. Familiars were little animals who were believed to suck bloods from teats on a witch's body. Investigators were also looking for evidence that witches met up and hung out, danced, drank, and frolicked in nighttime orgies of satanic debauchery deep in the woods called sabbats. These ceremonies perverted the natural order and harked back to pre-Reformation Catholic feast days, with food, flirtation, drinking, and illicit sex, of course. 4 women from Manningtree were chosen to search Elizabeth Clark's body for the telltale marks left by suckling familiars. It's likely that all of her body hair was shaved, and the older woman, shaken, naked, and with nobody to defend her, was poked and prodded for signs of the witch's mark. 3 teats were duly found by the searchers, and the next task fell to other villagers to watch and wait for the familiars to arrive and reveal others who attended sabbats, thereby proving the woman's compact with the devil. The atmosphere in Elizabeth Clark's single-room house prickled with anticipation. For 3 nights, Elizabeth Clark was kept under house arrest, seated in the middle of the room, not allowed to sleep, her face shrouded in the shadows produced by the cheap and dim rushlights that burnt through the night. After 3 fruitless nights, Stern and Hopkins arrived, demanding the names of others in the demonic conspiracy that threatened this part of East Anglia. At first, the old woman refused, yet when they turned to leave, her feeble voice called out, "I will show you my imps, for they be ready to come." She pointed for Hopkins and Stern to sit, and the group waited for half an hour in the pregnant silence. She began to call out the name, "Halt!" Nothing happened at first, until the watchers began to feel another presence in the room. A white creature appeared, like a small cat, who silently crept up to Elizabeth Clark, who gave it a soft stroke, and then it crept off into the shadows. Next, she called out Jamara, after which a creature that looked like a dog with short legs appeared and then ran away. Thereafter, a succession of strange creatures arrived. Vinegar Tom, who looked like a greyhound with legs like a stag, a polecat or a ferret, a toad, and a black beast called Sack and Sugar, who looked suspiciously like a black rabbit. It didn't occur to the watchers that these supposed infernal beasts may have in fact been the animal companions of a lonely old woman, rendered so shaken and despondent by the lack of sleep and the humiliation she had endured, admitting to anything that the searchers asked, so that her torment might be brought to an end. The confused older woman duly confessed to having slept with the devil. Despite the dire circumstances in which the confession was produced, there is an element of humour to Elizabeth Clark's confession. When asked by Matthew Hopkins the form that the devil had taken, she replied, "A tall, proper, black-haired gentleman, a properer man than yourself." When Stern asked whether she'd rather sleep with Hopkins or the devil, she replied emphatically, "The devil." Elizabeth Clark went on to name Anne and Rebecca West as her accomplices, and Matthew Hopkins left in a huff, the young man's pride presumably bruised by Elizabeth Clark's low estimation of his physical appearance. On his ride home, he testified that his dog was accosted by a small white creature who wounded its shoulder, and on his return home, he claimed that he caught the gaze of a huge black cat squatting on a strawberry bush in his yard. The next day, Elizabeth Clark was brought before the magistrates and confessed that Anne West had taken pity on her poverty and old age and had offered Elizabeth a diabolical bargain. If some of Anne West's familiars could have use of Elizabeth's body, she would want for food no more. The old widow, her life marked by poverty and chronic scarcity, agreed to the bargain, and thus condemned herself to a life as Satan's servant. Back in Lawford, Anne and Rebecca were arrested and sent to the magistrate to be examined, after which all three women were subsequently committed to jail in Colchester Castle to await trial. Colchester Castle was an old Norman structure, which had been allowed to crumble to little more than a ruin over the preceding 3 centuries. In the 1630s, the roof had collapsed and the prisoners were exposed to rain, wind, snow, and all the illnesses that these poor conditions entailed. Close to the walls, dripping wet with rainwater, Elizabeth Clark, Rebecca, and Anne West huddled in the shadows. Aware of the potential harmful effects of such a trip to his health, yet enlivened by his Puritan sense of duty to carry out God's work on earth, Matthew Hopkins puffed out his chest and swaggered into the jail. Crouching next to the 3 miserable occupants, alternating between whispered threats and insincere promises of salvation, he managed to coax out the names of other members of the coven, as well as turn Rebecca against her mother. More and more women were entangled in the web of accusation, and the ranks of unfortunate prisoners swelled the dilapidated ruin of Colchester Castle. These revelations were shared with the local community, which invigorated old quarrels and trivial disputes, and still more people were arrested and implicated as members of this coven. As Hopkins was intimidating his victims in Colchester Castle, it became clear that his exploits in Manningtree were already paying dividends in rooting out a coven of witches across the county. News arrived of more witches in a small community called Thorpe to the southwest of Manningtree. This agricultural settlement was surrounded by cliffs and marshes, which made for a claustrophobic setting and fractious community. Rampant inflation had caused untold suffering for many families and individuals, and one such woman was Margaret Moon, a poor widow who had been evicted from her cottage in the 1620s. When a local child died after eating one of Margaret's apples, and a woman was swept off her feet by a mysterious army of lice, the envious and malign influence of Margaret Moon was detected. Moon was subsequently arrested and searched for teats. 3 were duly found, and after being asked to call her familiars, Moon agreed if she was given bread and beer. After the creatures, Jesus, Jockey, Sandy, Colin, and Mistress Elizabeth failed to make an appearance, Moon flew into a rage and blamed her daughters, who she also implicated as fellow witches. Meanwhile, in Little Bentley, poor widow Mary Greenleaf was accused of having suckled a hare as an imp sent by the devil. This hare was often seen sitting outside Mary's cottage, its eyes fixed on the inside. Once, a dog had charged at the hare, then mysteriously stopped in its tracks as if held by the hare's gaze. It sickened and died shortly after. The choice of the accuser to include a hare in this case is significant. Since prehistory, hares have been linked to the sinister and the supernatural. Fast, elusive, untamable, and with an eerie scream that can be mistaken for a child's cry, it's easy to understand why the accuser chose a hare as the ultimate companion to Mary Greenleaf. In the spring of 1645, a very real moral panic about a coven of witches gripped North Essex. The tendrils of this hellish association seemed to corrupt every village. Rampant rumours of this satanic conspiracy overtook alehouse conversation. Increasingly, the spread of witchcraft was seen as symptomatic of the social inversion that was occurring across the whole country at the time. Villages had been depleted of men who were off fighting the Civil War, leaving them with women as the figures of authority. The country was also without a single leader for the first time in generations, and frightening portents of the imminent apocalypse, such as comets, flashed across the night skies. In this climate of fear, accusations of witchcraft abounded. After visiting Thorpe to deal with Margaret Moon, the local magistrate, Harbottle Grimston, toured the villages in his jurisdiction to root out more witches. His route took him through Kirby, Walton, Wivenhoe, St. Osyth, Great Holland, and the dreary dungeons of Colchester swelled with more of the accused, until by July the number had reached 29. Now, due to the chaos and disruption that the Civil War had caused, it was pretty unsafe for the well-trained and legally experienced assize judges to venture out from London to dispense justice in the regions. During much of the Civil War, they were replaced by local landholders such as the Earl of Warwick, who was a talented general but an inexperienced jurist. The Earl of Warwick rode into town to preside over the Chelmsford Assizes, in which the 29 prisoners held in the depths of Colchester Castle were going to be put on trial for witchcraft. Before the trial, they were housed in the Shire House prison and spent their last hours before learning their fates in prayer, conversation, and quiet contemplation. When they appeared in the courtroom, their emaciated and sickly faces, soiled by dirt and the rags that they wore exhibiting the months spent imprisoned in hellish conditions, they must have appeared to the spectators in the gallery and the impressionable young judge to be the living manifestations of Satan's assistants on earth. Matthew Hopkins and John Stern were only too happy to bolster this view by testifying against Elizabeth Clark and another defendant. In the raucous and charged atmosphere of Chelmsford's courtroom, 9 women were reprieved to barrack jeers from the packed gallery. Interestingly, none of those who were spared the hangman's noose came from cases involving Matthew Hopkins and John Stern, showing their growing finesse at building unsinkable cases against those they regarded as the embodiment of pure evil. As Matthew Hopkins saw the 15 condemned women mount the hastily constructed scaffold in Chelmsford's Market Square, as he watched the poor bewildered old women beg their executioner for mercy or meet their fate with stoical detachment, his heart swelled with pride. He had proven himself a skilled investigator, for which he had been handsomely financially rewarded. Not only this, he had also shown himself to be a member of the godly elect who had succeeded in rooting out evil in his community. His legacy seemed secure and his future bright. As the sun cast looming shadows over the market square, and the shadows of the condemned swayed softly in the breeze, a smile spread across Matthew Hopkins' face. Chapter 3. The Apex of Power. The Witchfinders crossed the River Stour into Suffolk in July 1645, and immediately separated. John Stern took the western side of the county, and Hopkins took the east. We can pinpoint John Stern in 23 cases of witchcraft accusations to the west of the old Ipswich to Norwich road, and we can pinpoint Hopkins in 26 cases to the east. This suggests that the 2 intrepid witchfinders divided the county and came up with a plan to comb it effectively. Despite visiting a similar number of places, Stern stayed closer to his family in Lawshall. The locations he visited were never more than a few hours' ride away from his home, whereas Hopkins travelled more widely across the county. This suggests that the younger man, who had no dependents and was freer to roam across the open land, rarely, if ever, returned home on his circuit of dispensing justice. It's perhaps due to this increased agency and its adventurous connotations that the myth of Hopkins was born, and more people today know about Matthew Hopkins than John Stern. Up to this point, Matthew Hopkins and John Stern had largely been directed in their efforts to purge witches from the community by the magistrate Harbottle Grimston. They served as his assistants, extracting confessions and testifying against suspects at the Chelmsford trial. Their actions after this trial marked a departure from this modus operandi. From this point onwards, Hopkins and Stern travelled East Anglia alone, carrying letters of assurance from Parliament, usually arriving in towns by invitation, and carrying out God's work assisted by a small team of women who were used to search suspects for the Devil's Mark that they'd recruited from Manningtree. It's in this summer that the myth of Hopkins is fully born. At this point, Hopkins becomes the spectral arbiter of divine justice dressed in black, prowling the narrow lanes and hedgerows of this vast, flat expanse of the fenland. Now, some interesting features emerge about the nature of the victims of Stern and Hopkins as they progress through Suffolk. While the common factor behind all of their victims in Essex was poverty, two new traits were added to poverty when we consider the background of the people and the areas that they hunted in around Suffolk, namely, links to Catholicism and being a woman past childbearing age. The cases that John Stern investigated at Bramford provide a textbook example of poverty seeming to act as a motivator for a demonic pact. Here, John Chambers admitted to using a toad imp to murder his own child. This provides us with an interesting insight into the hopes and desires of the poor. To improve their lot in the face of an oppressive society, they had to sacrifice one of their children, using the only creatures below them in God's great chain of being, animals. Stern then travelled through Hitcham, Coddenham, Creating St Mary, Rattlesden, Weatherden and Bacton. Now, in some of these places, it gradually becomes more obvious that Stern wasn't just using poverty to profile potential suspects. Another means of profiling emerges, their fertility. In a world whose values had changed in the space of a few generations from communitarianism and mutual support to individualism and self-sufficiency, poor women often found that their fertility was their only currency. With increasing age came an increasingly ambiguous social position, unable to any more sustain village life by procreating and potentially being seen as a burden on meagre resources. In the mind of Stern, they served as an easy target for the wiles of the devil, and in the minds of other villagers, the Witchfinders may have been seen as a useful tool for unburdening these villagers of their economically inactive dependence. The unpleasant tang of ageism and misogyny may be detected in the character of Stern's victims in Bacton. 60-year-old Mary Bush, who had made her living for the past 20 years begging, was accused. Then the middle-aged pauper, Elizabeth Watcham, was implicated as her accomplice by her fellow villagers. The two women were arrested and sent away from the village that they had known all of their lives to Ipswich to wait for a trial at Bury St Edmunds later in the summer. Hopkins too was innovating. In his wide arc across the east of Suffolk, he was using the religious background of an area as a pretext for close scrutiny. He must have believed that areas with strong Catholic traditions harboured a greater number of witches, judging by his investigations in Chattersham, Hintlesham and Copdock, all outposts of aristocratic families who had remained Catholic and then fled the area in the face of increasing persecution. In Hintlesham and Copdock, Widow Bigsby, Rebecca Morris and Susan Marchant were stripped, searched for marks and browbeaten into confessions by Matthew Hopkins. Once again, the women were removed to Ipswich to await justice. These three characteristics of poverty, infertility and local links to Catholicism effectively combined at Framlingham to make it very fertile ground for Hopkins' witch hunt. Framlingham Castle was the ancient seat of the Catholic Howard family, who played a gigantic role in Tudor politics, with Catherine Howard being Henry VIII's fifth wife. The family had long since fled this hotbed of religious radicalism, yet some local Catholics remained, creating a community that was riven by religious discord. Added to the mix was a recent development of increasing shortages of land, houses and work due to the arrival of huge numbers of Irish refugees who had served as a drain on the town's already meagre resources. These tensions led to accusations against Mother Palmer and Mary Edwards, themselves both older, poorer members of the local community. In the Framlingham case, a sinister new method of getting confessions was added to the previously used approaches of watching, searching and sleep deprivation by Hopkins. Not only were suspected witches thrown into the moat of the castle to see if they floated, a sign that the water was rejecting them and that they had made a deal with the devil, but they were also walked. What walking meant was being forced to march up and down a room until they were exhausted. When we consider that the vast majority of victims were older, from poorer backgrounds, so more likely to be in poor health or malnourished, deprived of sleep, and verbally bombarded by a well-educated outsider, it seems likely that they'd be willing to say anything to make the torment end. Unsurprisingly, Hopkins' new methods paid immediate dividends. His method of walking suspects unveiled a whole coven of witches, with Marjorie Chinnery, Elizabeth Mann, Mother Neville, Margaret Wyard, and Mary Edwards, themselves all poor older women, being implicated after Elizabeth Mann was interrogated using his new process. As before, the women joined the ever-expanding ranks of the imprisoned in a gloomy Ipswich dungeon. The fate of the vicar, John Lowes, at Brandeston, a tiny village about 4 miles from Framlingham, demonstrates most clearly the role that religion played in accusation, and the lengths that Hopkins would go in order to get a confession. A man in his 80s who had been the vicar for as long as anyone cared to remember, John Lowes had developed a reputation as an enemy of Puritanism by having the pulpit of his church rebuilt in a Catholic-seeming style. This made him a natural target for the young Puritan zealot, Matthew Hopkins. In truth, as many of Hopkins' other victims, he had a reputation for witchcraft stretching back for generations. He had frequently clashed with radical members of his congregation, being sued by them and suing them back for slander successively over a period of about 20 years. When the figure of Hopkins rode into town on that feverishly hot late July day, clad in black with his characteristic sugarloaf hat, he would have been well aware of the rumours swirling about the elderly Lowes, as he was the owner of a property in the local area. Lowes' main crime had been to have the temerity to visit one of Hopkins' victims from Framlingham in jail, Marjorie Chinnery, to give her comfort and convince her not to confess. Perhaps it was a combination of Hopkins' resentment at this unforeseen obstacle to his divine mission thrown up by the aged Lowes, as well as his self-admitted defiance of Hopkins' Puritan theology that led him to be treated so harshly. Hopkins' torture plainly broke the old man. When Brandeston's pre-Civil War lord returned in the 1660s and inquired about the curmudgeonly old vicar he remembered from his youth, he was told that they watched him and kept him awake several nights together, and ran him backwards and forwards about the room until he was out of breath. Then they rested him a little, and then ran him again. Thus they did this for several days and nights together, till he was weary of his life, and was scarce sensible of what he said or did. But still the old man would not confess, so Hopkins ordered that he be carried the 4 miles to Framlingham Castle, and thrown into the putrid water of the moat. Eventually exhaustion prevailed, and the old man confessed. He confessed not only to making a pact with the devil, but to outrageous acts of sabotage of the parliamentarian cause in the Civil War, such as sinking one of Parliament's ships that he spied out at sea. He, too, was carried away to Ipswich to await trial at Bury St Edmunds later in the summer. It's worth saying here that we're talking about a young man in his early 20s torturing a succession of bewildered and vulnerable elderly people who had already faced the scorn of their neighbours throughout their lives. Quite often in history we think that time diminishes the culpability of wrongdoers. But that was in those days, we don't do that anymore kind of thing. But the extent of this cruelty wasn't normal for the time. We know this because the way the torture was recorded in the local parish register, which was pretty critical. And then when people in London found out about the case of John Lowes, they wrote pamphlets condemning the brutality with which he was treated. But this is the story of a man so hyped up on notions of cleansing the world of sinners and driven by flagrant self-interest, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that he was driven to committing acts of extreme abuse. Hopkins and Stern continued their work in Suffolk throughout July and August, so that by the time a special commission was sent from London to try the swelling ranks of accused witches at Bury St Edmunds on the 26th of August, the number of accused people reached over 100, and a barn had to be used to contain all of them before the trial. Throughout the trial, there were hints of what was to come later. The judge rebuked Hopkins and Stern for using the water ordeal to test the suspect's guilt, and the jury acquitted a huge number of those accused. Nevertheless, the Bury trial represented the apex of Hopkins' power. He, Matthew Hopkins, carried letters from Parliament allowing him to roam freely and lend his expert witch-finding advice across East Anglia and be handsomely rewarded in turn. He, Matthew Hopkins, whose name cropped up in ballads and the gossip of London's intelligentsia, had ensnared the elderly vicar John Lowes by proving his guilt as a witch. He, Matthew Hopkins, God's servant, had been personally responsible for the deaths of 18 satanic apostates on a late August day in Bury St Edmunds. Chapter 4. Downfall. Today, Dunwich barely exists at all. Most of the settlement has been lost to the sea, earning Dunwich the flattering but maybe somewhat ironic nickname of Britain's Atlantis. As Matthew Hopkins rode over the crest of the hill and saw the town bathed in the warmth of a September sunset, he'd have been met with a different sight. He'd have seen a seaside town full of fishing boats, shrieking seagulls, and a choice of bustling inns to bed down for the night after his long ride. Nevertheless, the process which has largely submerged the now village was already well underway by 1645. By the 1640s, its harbour had silted up, grand merchant houses sunk beneath the waves, and unprecedented poverty became a feature of life of many of its inhabitants. It was a town haunted by the ghosts of its more prosperous past, with considerable hardship experienced by the townsfolk and the resultant social tensions that this entailed. Fresh off his success at Bury, Dunwich must have seemed like fertile ground for Hopkins. Once again, at Dunwich, the character of his victims remained similar. Priscilla Collett, an older woman of modest means, confessed that she had given in to a demonic urge and tried to set her child on fire and bewitch a barge. Elizabeth Southern's background was similar. She claimed that Priscilla had sent her a familiar in the shape of a crayfish and that she had slept with the devil. Once again, we can see Hopkins making use of a peculiar psychological dynamic to root out supposed covens, pushing vulnerable people to the brink of mania until they gave him other names, thereby pleasing him and ceasing their suffering, while confirming to himself the efficacy of his methods of torture and mental pressure. Hopkins then rode north, to Yarmouth in Norfolk, seeing 5 women hanged, and then south again as the weather began to turn, and the rain turned the tracks to mires, to Aldeburgh. As the icy rain of winter dripped from the brim of his hat and his eyes met those braving the downpour in Aldeburgh's muddy streets, he may have detected a new emotion in the faces of those he surveyed. He was used to adulation, fear too, but never before had he encountered this: resentment. Hopkins had visited Aldeburgh earlier in the summer, having been paid £2, equivalent to 2 months' wages for labourers, and having insisted on a £1 fee for Mary Phillips, a Manningtree resident who had been fetched from across the county to examine suspected witches. Now, the triumphant hero had returned to root out more witches, and the town corporation dug deep in its pockets and paid him the same again. Once more, men were dispatched to ride through gales and downpours to fetch Mary Phillips from Manningtree to assist Hopkins. Hopkins stayed at the Lion Inn, and Phillips joined him, and together they brought the number of witches housed in the town's cramped jail to 7, running up a bill of over £4 at the inn in the process. The town corporation subsequently had to raise taxes for local residents to make up the colossal hole that a visit from East Anglia's preeminent witchfinder had blown in the town's finances. As Hopkins rode out of town on that winter day, no wonder he endured a few glares from the town's newly penniless inhabitants. Witch-finding was no cheap business. Housing prisoners who were unable to provide for themselves in prison also put financial strain on local ratepayers, after the judge from Bury St Edmunds recommended that the cost of searching, watching, prosecuting and housing witches should be, and I quote, borne by the inhabitants of the town as a general charge. As Hopkins rode into a town, church wardens and overseers of the poor were forced to spring into action to collect the new levy entailed by the process of witch hunting. Imprisonment was always the greatest cost. As those waiting for the trial at Bury and those acquitted lingered in Ipswich prison, they accrued a cost of around £50 a month, which led the jailer to petition the town authorities to levy a one-off tax to fund the unusually large number of prisoners housed in the town jail. This was happening right at a time when central government was beginning to reassert itself, calling for jails to be emptied for reasons of sanitation and public safety. In the event of the Royalists taking control of a town, prisons offered them a ready-made, motley crew of new recruits for the King's army. In January, Parliament had freed 40 prisoners from Newgate Prison in London, calling for other prisons in areas of the country under their control to do the same. Matthew Hopkins' discoveries of whole covens of witches was antithetical to this aim of government, as covens of witches produced scores of prisoners. This did not go unnoticed by London journalists, who had steadily commented on the bizarrely disproportionate number of witches being incarcerated in East Anglia. Parliament even ordered that no others be incarcerated in Norwich after intelligence arrived of a royalist plot to seize Norwich Castle. When a trial was held at the assizes, the costs could run into the hundreds of pounds. Assize trials were for those who had committed capital offences and therefore entailed a whole host of administrative costs. Judges needed paper, quills, candles, ink and rushes, not to mention a dizzying quantity and range of food and refreshments to meet their discerning tastes. For the Bury St Edmunds trial, which represented the height of Hopkins' power as over 100 victims had been put on trial, the judge sent an invoice for £130 to cover the costs of his month in Suffolk, equivalent to well over £100,000 today. The town of Sudbury spent over £2 on paperwork and hiring horses to transport witnesses to the assizes. Even the craftsmen who constructed the gallows on which the victims of Hopkins and Stern were hanged had to receive special disbursements due to the extraordinary number of executions taking place in East Anglia, which once again entailed rates being raised even higher for the town's inhabitants. By later 1645, it had become impractical, borderline impossible, and deeply unpopular to discover witches at the rate that Matthew Hopkins had earlier in the year. This doesn't even account for the intense psychological strain witch-finding had on communities. It's definitely worth saying that Hopkins and Stern's victims, their neighbours, their accusers, were all people with hopes, desires and dreams. When Hopkins and Stern rode out of a town or village, puffed up on a notion of having dispensed some form of justice, they left behind fractured communities with deep enmity felt by the families of accusers and victims alike. When Hopkins and Stern left a village, they left behind mothers who had lost their children, wives, husbands who had lost their partners, those who had lost lifelong friends in a matter of hours, and children who never saw their parents again. The scars that Hopkins and Stern inflicted on communities lingered for generations, and perhaps, gradually, people became more and more aware of the costs, not just the financial costs, that witch-finding entailed. These financial and psychological costs were not borne universally without resistance. Steadily, in places like Stowmarket, where Hopkins was paid £23 for his work, more than a craftsman working 6 full days a week would be paid for a year's work, more and more people refused to pay the increased taxes entailed by a visit from Hopkins. Criticism had steadily mounted, but up to this point it had mainly been financial rather than theological in its nature. Up to this point, Hopkins and Stern had been able to define their own narrative of the purpose and nature of their quest without a shred of accountability. The theological opposition to them finally arrived in 1646, and it came in an unlikely package. John Gall was a middle-aged Puritan cleric connected indirectly to Oliver Cromwell himself. A balding natural conservative, John Gall saw witch-finding as an irrational reflex brought on by hard times, which undercut the agency of God in predetermining the fate of his creations. To Gall, witch-finding itself showed the extent that the world had been turned upside down, in which unschooled parvenus roamed the land at will, masquerading as arbiters of biblical authority. Gall immediately began a campaign of preaching on the evils of witch-finding. He interviewed a victim of the witch hunters, Frances Moore, and was outraged when she revealed that she had been forced to sit cross-legged on a stool, then tied up and watched for 24 hours without being given any food in order to get her to confess. He wrote to the Witchfinders and was shocked to read their reply, in which they confirmed that they had used exactly the means of torture that Frances Moore had described. Gall launched into a campaign of sermons, decrying that an invention or practice of so much folly and superstition should emerge amidst so clear a light of the gospel. Criticism gradually built among other ministers across East Anglia, who reminded their parishioners every Sunday to not put too much faith in the abilities of witchfinders. Gall went on to publish a widely read pamphlet critical of the deeds of Hopkins, entitled Select Cases of Conscience. In this increasingly hostile climate, Hopkins and Stern largely stopped appearing at trials, but continued their hunts in Northamptonshire and Huntingdonshire. They were careful now to only travel to towns that they had been invited to. Nonetheless, they didn't stop doing what they knew best, torturing and coercing confessions from scores of unfortunate victims across these counties. Unfortunately for Hopkins, this subtle change of tactic didn't mean that he became immune from criticism, as he found to his cost in Norwich in spring 1647. By 1647, a semblance of normality had returned to East Anglia. Good weather was back, the plague had retreated, and the assizes returned, to be overseen once more by experienced judges, well schooled in statutes and precedents, who had travelled from London to judge Norfolk's most serious cases, just as they had done before the upheaval of the Civil War. This return of governmental authority emboldened a group of local gentlemen who, inspired by John Gall's select cases of conscience, drew up a list of probing questions to be presented to Matthew Hopkins, himself present as a witness at yet another witchcraft trial that he had helped bring about. The questions provided a level of scrutiny that Hopkins had not yet encountered. Hopkins retired to Manningtree to respond to these questions in a manner befitting the man who now styled himself the Witchfinder General, in a published pamphlet, The Discovery of Witches, in answer to several queries latterly delivered to the judges of assize for the county of Norfolk. Very, very snappy title there, Matthew. I thought it would be easiest to run through the questions posed to him and his responses in the pamphlet, which come across as a bit catty and dismissive to the questions that he was being asked. You can almost hear his sarcastic sighs and see him rolling his eyes as he responds to the questions. Question 1. Did Hopkins' success in discovering witches show that he himself had supernatural powers given to him by Satan? Hopkins responded, If Satan's kingdom be divided against itself, how shall it stand? Not a bad answer to start off with. Question 2. Had Hopkins stolen from the devil the book containing all of the witches in England? He said he wished he had this book in his possession, as it would have made his job easier. Question 3. If the skill he possessed in rooting out witches didn't come from formal education, why was he exceptionally blessed with the expertise in finding witches? He said he relied on experience rather than education. But there's a slight logical flaw to this argument, as Hopkins himself was very young, and he had only hunted witches for under 3 years. How he developed experience before his first encounter with the Manningtree witches, he didn't explain. Question 4. Why should the devil, a spirit, need to suck blood in order to sustain himself? Well, Matthew Hopkins saw it as a means of confirming the witches' deal with the devil rather than the devil sustaining himself. Question 5. Could signs of the devil suckling witches be trusted when they could easily be warts, piles, or the consequences of childbearing? Hopkins just didn't respond to this question. Question 6. Did Hopkins use torture and threats to get confessions out of people? Now, Hopkins defended swimming witches on the grounds that James I had encouraged it, and argued that people who had made a deal with the devil had denied their baptism, and therefore the water was rejecting them. He went on to play down any confessions that he had got from walking and watching the accused, and blatantly lied by arguing that he had never asked leading questions. The 7th question, and perhaps the most important to the gentleman who posed it, was this. Did witchfinders fleece the country of their money? Once again, Hopkins lied. He said he never took more than 20 shillings from a town, having ridden many miles there and staying there for a week. Once his pamphlet reached the towns of Aldeburgh or Yarmouth or Stowmarket, you can imagine the outrage it would have caused, with Hopkins charging far more than 20 shillings for his stays in those towns. After countless candlelit hours perfecting his response, having arranged for the pamphlet to be printed, Hopkins retired to bed, and unexpectedly retired from witch-finding completely. But it wasn't the increasing scrutiny or hostility to his divine quest that stopped Hopkins. He had always been a man apart, God's soldier on a mission, unconcerned with the petty grievances of others. What stopped Hopkins was that by 1647 he was not a well man. For months he had been plagued by a lack of appetite and a rasping cough, presumably picked up in his hours intimidating witnesses in dank and airless jails. It was left to John Stern to have one last Indian summer of witch hunting around the Isle of Ely. As he rode out for his final sortie, he knew that the good old days of witch hunting were long gone. The previous 2 summers a distant memory, and his favourite pastime now a solo sport. Chapter 5. What came next? On the 12th of August 1647, sleep didn't come easily to Matthew Hopkins. The air was heavy with the strong smell of onions, the unmistakable tang of pleural tuberculosis. As his body convulsed in another coughing fit, he began to panic. Playing on his mind was what would happen to his soul next. He knew by now he wasn't long for this world. He'd grown steadily weaker over the summer, and he knew it was just a matter of hours rather than days in which he would meet his Maker and be judged whether he was worthy to enter the kingdom of eternal paradise. He glibly weighed up his life in his head. He had detected and been responsible for the deaths of over 100 witches, and in doing so had weakened the power of the devil. But something was nagging him at the back of his mind. What he couldn't quite get out of his head, try as he might, were the faces of the condemned, when they knew that their time was short, as he felt now. The matter not being resolved, Hopkins exhaled for the last time and died. As a Puritan, little ceremony marked his passing. No church bells, no psalms, no sprigs of rosemary in his coffin. He was buried alone in the churchyard of St. Mary, Mistley Heath, where his body remains to this day. It isn't known if John Stern ever visited the grave of his former partner. For his part, John Stern also responded to criticism aimed at him as a sequel to Hopkins' own pamphlet and a homage to a dying art. His finished product, A Confirmation and Discovery of Witches, copied other texts verbatim and supplemented this with self-aggrandizing anecdotes and nostalgia. In his later years, John Stern returned to the shadows, suing towns for payments he believed he was due, and in 1651, in a court hearing in which a neighbour had called him a thief, declared himself worth less than £5, the fortune he must have accrued only 4 years earlier having deserted him. He later declassed himself from being a gentleman to a yeoman and found employment as a scribe, dying in 1670. By the time he died, elite opinion had already swung definitively against the art of witch-finding. In 1650, Cambridge occultist Henry Moore referred to Hopkins as that troublesome fellow. The next generation began to poke fun at Hopkins and Stern, with a stage play from 1682, including a character called Sir Geoffrey Shacklehead, who wanted to search, watch, swim and prick witches, but can't even remember the titles of the demonological texts he's read. Charles II's chief satirist, Samuel Butler, referred to Hopkins in a poem. Has not this present Parliament, a ledger to this devil sent, fully empowered to treat about, finding revolted witches out? And has he not within a year hanged 70 of 'em in one share, some only for not being drowned, and some for sitting above ground, whole days and nights upon their breeches, and feeling pain were hanged for witches? I was trying to make it rhyme on some of those lines there. I hope you appreciate that. Samuel Butler went on to start the myth that Hopkins had his comeuppance during his life. John Stern came in to defend his old friend and set the record straight about how Hopkins had actually died, but he couldn't hold back the tide of the myth of Hopkins. The theory that Hopkins had made a rod for his own back was expanded upon by a Suffolk curate, Francis Hutchinson, who stated that Hopkins had failed the swimming test, ending up a dejected wretch who was hanged as a witch. We know that Stern's account is far more accurate, but we also know that by the 1680s, fewer and fewer judges were sending accused witches to the gallows, and the reputations of Hopkins and Stern lay in tatters. At the start of Part 1, I asked whether the ethereal bogeyman figure of Matthew Hopkins is a fair representation of the man. I've come to the conclusion that the evidence suggests that it probably is. He tortured and browbeat the most vulnerable, the easiest targets he could have picked. The Bury St Edmunds trial accounted for a whopping 3.6% of the total executions for witchcraft ever in England, with 18 people being put to death. Hopkins punched downwards and was driven in a large part by self-interest. But I think what the traditional view of Hopkins perhaps misses out on is his intense Puritan devotion that he sincerely held. He was less a brazen opportunist driven purely by the prospect of personal enrichment, but a religious extremist on what he thought was a mission to purge the world of the influence of Satan. What the traditional story of Hopkins also misses out is the context in which he operated, which allowed him, and even encouraged him, to commit acts of unspeakable cruelty. Stern and Hopkins were operating in a strange liminal time in which old certainties were being destroyed and being replaced by new realities. In this strange new world without a king, without strong central government, where mutual support gave way to naked self-interest, where religious discord was endemic to the country, these men could operate freely without fear of retribution or constraints on their cruelty or methods. With the advent of the end of the Civil War and the return of a semblance of governmental authority, these freewheeling opportunists or godly zealots were deprived of some of their agency. Sociopolitical factors conspired to make their witch hunts possible, and these same factors ended their reverie. And today, well, what's their legacy? Stern and Hopkins. One man forgotten, one man remembered for all of the wrong reasons. But I do think their stories give us something valuable today about the importance of not delegating judicial control to bad actors and ensuring that the most vulnerable, those that Stern and Hopkins preyed upon, are protected from scapegoating and from the politics of fear. I will show you my imps, for they be ready to come.